Hello, Bible readers. Bible scholars, really any kind of scholars, can get lost in the weeds. I mean, it's kind of their job to not stay in the familiar, on the well-trodden paths that pretty much anybody can walk through, and to instead go check this out and that out. Sometimes those explorations into places unknown lead to very useful discoveries. I'd never thought of that before. Or, well, how about that? Are the kinds of reactions that scholars can provoke in us with their literary criticism and historical criticism and all the criticisms. And if you're not familiar with that language, literary criticism, for example, is when a scholar reads up on all the different literatures of an era, right? So, like, read a bunch of different kinds of things that were written then as a kind of context that may shed light on what the author means with a phrase or a character or an allusion to certain wisdom that maybe we don't share or are as familiar with now. When they use a character or a metaphor or a story, literary criticism can help make sense of that kind of thing. Historical criticism is when a scholar studies the actual history of the people from whom a psalm, for example, comes, right? So if a psalm claims to be of David, well, then a historical criticism scholar would want to make sure they know everything they can know, historically speaking, about David. And sometimes historical sources can be pretty tough to find. Getting at the historical criticism sources, it's a lot of work. But the goal is that maybe that history shines light on why a psalm is such a lament at that moment in the history of Israel, or why David, a king, would say such and such at this moment in his life or in the life of Israel. So we owe a lot to biblical scholarship, for sure. They help us derive meaning from what can be otherwise very murky ancient writings. Like, oftentimes I'll get done with a Bible story, not just a psalm, but just anything, and be like, what? And it is literary or historical some kind of criticism. Some scholars' work has helped me make sense of something. But even Walter Brueggemann and William Bellinger, who are biblical scholars, they are the scholars who authored my big giant commentary, even they admit that sometimes when scholars take a turn into the weeds, they get lost there. I'm especially thinking about this in light of many scholars' efforts to figure out how Psalm 54 was originally used and by whom. And oftentimes when you read different scholars speaking to each other through their books and through articles and other things that they write, it can almost be comical at how much they can battle over things that are unknowable and maybe just don't matter anyway. Maybe it was David himself as king, as he faced foreign armies in battle, who wrote and spoke this psalm. But that makes me wonder, so, like, what was this psalm taken from his personal journal, as though he spoke to God in poetry during his bedtime prayers when, he was in the midst of a siege or a battle or something? Or, scholars wonder, maybe the speaker comes from among the poor in ancient Israel. Maybe it's not the king at all, but maybe, could it be more different kinds of people? Maybe the speaker comes from among the poor. This person is oppressed somehow, comes to the temple to seek relief from the God who is known to deliver. Okay? Or maybe it's someone who faces a false accusation and wants a judicial hearing in the temple to vindicate him. We've seen psalms do something like this before. But as Brueggemann says, all of these are plausible for the who and in what context. But the language in Psalm 54 is vague enough that maybe what's most notable is it's adaptable for all kinds of moments in this life. And maybe that that it is adaptable. Maybe that is the important trait of this psalm to be celebrated so many years later. Maybe that's the context scholars who get lost in the weeds lose track of. Maybe the author of this psalm deliberately did not specify a situation so that this psalm could apply to many situations. Bottom line, the psalmist and any of us who pray this psalm are a faithful worshiper who faces some kind of oppression and brings their very confident, faithful plea to the covenant God of Israel, who has been known to deliver people from trouble and woe. That's what's going on here. Hear my prayer, O God. Establish your justice. I'm confident you will, because you have before. And then the last few verses are a remarkable vow of thanksgiving and sacrifice for something that hasn't quite happened yet, it seems. This psalm is another example, and we saw this quite a bit in the first book of the Psalms. It's another example of a psalmist living into the now but not yet. Everything about the psalm tells us that the deliverance that the psalmist is praying about has not yet happened, but the psalmist's confidence is so great that he says in the past tense, he says it, my eye has looked in triumph on my enemies. Like, that's an amazing thing to say when you're in the thick of things, right? Whatever you're in the thick of, to write something as though you, even in that moment, my eye has looked in triumph on my enemies. That is faith-filled imagination. The faith and hope of Psalm 54 are so much more important than the answers to the questions, who and when exactly was this psalm prayed? The good news is it can be prayed by us now. I am one with my God. My God is with us, all of us, at all times and in all places.